Hey nerdy knitters, in this video we're going to look at Addi FlexiFlip needles and we'll compare them to regular double pointed needles, or DPNs as we often refer to them. I'll demonstrate how to cast on double point needles and Addi FlexiFlips, and I'll show you how to join in the round and how that compares and how much easier it is on Addi FlexiFlip needles. And I'll also give you some tips on how to manage the needles as you're working your socks or any other small tubes. But before we do that, I just want to say, hey, I'm Tanya here at Nerdy Knitting. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a knitwear designer, and my goal is to help you become a confident, adventurous knitter. You'll find timestamp links in the video description box down below, as well as a link to the website where you can see more about Addi FlexiFlip needles. When you purchase a set of Addi FlexiFlips, they come in a little tube like this. This size I have here is 2.5mm or US 1, good for knitting socks or other small things. It's a set of 3 needles, and they are a little over 8 inches long, as you can see right here. Each of the tips is 3.5 inches, and there is a 1-inch cord in between, and that's where we get that FlexiFlips. It looks like a double pointed needle on each end, but they are flexible in the middle like circular needles. And each of the tips are 2 of Addi's tips. There's the blunt tip, which is the Addi Turbo, and the more pointed tip is an Addi Rocket tip. So if you're familiar with Addi needles, then you might be familiar with what these tips are like. But that's nice because if you prefer to work with a blunt tip, you can do most of your knitting with that blunt edge. If you prefer the sharper tip, and I usually do when I'm knitting socks, I prefer to hold this edge in my right hand while I knit. And while these tips are metal, they also now come in bamboo, and they even come in longer 10-inch lengths. So if you want to knit larger things like maybe sleeves or something like that, then they have longer ones. These are probably only good for small tubes like socks and smaller things like that. Now here's an 8-inch double pointed needle. They're about the same. Addi is a little bit longer. Now here's some of my favorite needles. I have a set of ChowGoo interchangeables, and I have the 4-inch tips, and this is how they compare lengthwise. I mean, the diameter is vastly different, but you can see lengthwise they're about the same as the ChowGoo 4-inch tips. So if you're familiar with the ChowGoo needles, you'll see the length is about the same. Now if you know you prefer a longer needle and you're not a fan of the 4-inch tips, then you might want to look at the Addi FlexiFlips that are a little longer. They're 10-inch lengths. Now if you're using double points, you know that it is kind of a pain to cast on stitches when you've got all of these needles to wrangle, especially if you're using 5 needles. I've got some stitches cast on here. I still need to cast on some more. But one of your options for casting on is just simply to cast them all onto one needle and then slip them to the other needles. I'm going to just slip a few so you can see that method. I've already cast on my stitches, so I'm just going to slip some to the 3rd needle. For people who don't like double points, this is usually the sticking point. They don't like having to wrangle all of these needles while they try to join their stitches while they cast on. Now this is where Addi really shines, because instead of casting on to 3 or 4 needles like you are for your double points, you only have to cast on to 2, and I'll show you how to do that. I'm going to do a long tail cast on, and I'll skip the first slip knot and just swoop around and catch my yarn, and that'll be my first stitch. So we'll just do a few so you can get a feel for what's happening here. And of course I could cast all of the stitches right onto this needle and then slip half of them to the other needle, but I'm going to walk you through how it looks to do. There's some on that needle, and I want to cast on some more onto the next needle, so I'll just hold them parallel, get my yarn set up in my hands again, hold it right there, and I'm just going to continue casting on. And that first one, you want to make sure you're snug with the first needle, but then after that just separate them a bit and get your stitches all cast on. So you can see already this is much easier to cast on stitches. I only have these 2, and I did that fairly quickly, as opposed to our regular double points where we've got, oh man, this is, yeah, kind of a pain when you're first starting, especially with small things like socks and that fine yarn. So if it was time to join and start working in the round on double pointed needles. I'm not even going to bother casting on to 4 needles. We'll just use 4 and skip that 5th needle. You want to make sure everything is lined up, get the yarn situated. Make sure all your stitches are lined up and not twisted around the needles. I'm going to grab the needle that you're going to be joining and the yarn that you'll be using. Make sure you grab the correct one, not the tail. Okay, we want to snug up our needles here. Catch that yarn and knit that first stitch. And you can see, I don't mind double points, but starting socks on double points is a pain to me. There, we've got them joined, and now you would start working across that first needle. And while you're working across, you've got a needle here and a needle in the back, needles sticking out everywhere. So this does take some getting used to. This is why new knitters often get frustrated with sock knitting or other small things, because it's hard to manage all those needles. Now let's compare that to Addi's, where we've only got stitches on 2 needles. Start the same, making sure nothing's twisted around. And make sure all of our stitches are facing the right way. Now you've got the working yarn on the back needle and the stitches that you're going to work on the front, and you grab your 3rd needle and you decide which tip you like to use. I like the pointier tip, so I'll use that. Make sure you get your tail out of the way and grab your working yarn. And I'm just going to do a simple join in the round. No extra stitches. Give the first few a little tug to snug them up a little. And that's it. Now we're only wrangling 3 needles instead of 4, and the flexible points in the middle of each of the needles makes them easier to manage. I can just move it under here out of the way in the palm of my hand and just work across the stitches. It's that simple. So we've joined in the round, we've even started working. So you can see the difference. We have 3 or 4 and 5 needles going on here, trying to wrangle all of those. And with this, everything's just on the 2 needles, and we work back and forth. You can see how easy it is to join in the round and start working on Addi FlexiFlips. And I have a few more tips about avoiding ladders, which are a common thing when you use other methods of working in the round, and some other tips. Before that, if you have any comments or questions about Addi FlexiFlips, be sure to leave them down below. I'll do my best to answer any of your questions. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Now let's look at those tips. One common issue people have with all types of circular knitting, whether it is magic loop, DPNs, working on 2 circulars, is the ladders you get in between your needles. As you can see right here, I don't have any ladders. Oh, it might be a little loose right there, the stitch just underneath, but there's no ladders. No ladders there. So when I'm working on FlexiFlips, the stitches I'm working, I like to push up onto the needle, and the stitches on the back needle, I like to sort of push them down so they're all sitting on the cable and out of the way. And then the needle, the other tips of the needles, I can just sort of push down with the palm of this hand, and I can work with this one and keep this one out of the way with this hand. Now to avoid ladders, that first stitch is still sitting on the back needle. To keep it its full size. If we tighten it up too much, then we're going to have a mess here too, trying to move stitches. But that first stitch, I just like to snug up and make sure it's right beside that stitch on the back. And the next one I knit a bit firmly too, and then I just go right to my normal knitting tension. I don't try to tighten everything up. And that's enough to keep from getting ladders. And once I have a few stitches, I use my hand to push this needle out of the way. And then I'm really just working on those 2 front needles, and nothing else is really in my way. When you're working on double points, you'll notice you've got needles flying everywhere and moving everywhere and knocking around. At least I do. So I prefer these when I'm knitting socks, because I can push those needle tips out of the way. You can see as I'm working here, I've got this one sort of pushed back with my finger. Sometimes I use all my fingers or just this one just to keep it out of the way. And the tips over here, I've just got in the palm of my hand underneath my knitting. I've got the yarn in my hand and I sort of use my palm to push them out of the way. So the only 2 needles I'm really paying attention to are the 2 that are in my hand. And I can work right across the row. As you can see, it's very similar to magic loop. I mean, with magic loop you would have one needle, well, two needles and one cord, and you'd have your things divided into two like this. You'd pull out your back needle to work across the front. It's also similar, I think it's more similar to working on two circulars, because that's really what you're doing. In that method you would just use the two needles and work across there, but in this case we have that third. But it's easy to do things because everything's just divided in half. You can always change the stitch amount you have on each needle, but it's perfect for knitting socks because you can keep the instep on one and the foot on the other. Work in stockinette where you need to, work your pattern. You can work back and forth on just the one while you're working the heel. There are lots of benefits to working with these types of needles, and for knitting socks, it's my favorite method. Now you know how to cast on and join in the round and start working on your Addi FlexiFlip needles. If you have any comments or questions about using these needles, be sure to leave them in the comments down below, and I'll do my best to answer them. If you found this video helpful, give it a thumbs up, and be sure to subscribe if you like to get nerdy with your knitting.